It's October 4th, and we are talking about Tropical Depression number 16 in the far southwestern Caribbean. I'm Chief Meteorologist Alan Seals. Now, earlier today, the hurricane hunters found enough wind to declare this a tropical depression, meaning it has a slight circulation with the maximum wind of 35 miles an hour. It's moving northwestward off the coast of Nicaragua, and that means tonight it's going to move onshore and then cross through Honduras, mainly as a rainmaker. 10, 15, 20 inches of rain, maybe up to 30 in the mountains. There's earlier the actual flight path of the hurricane hunters out of Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, and that gives us an idea of what's going on exactly in the clouds. Now, here's the projection. Various computer models move it onshore overnight, and it will likely become a tropical storm. Back into the Caribbean during the daytime tomorrow, maybe back onshore going into the weekend, then into the Gulf, and then making landfall somewhere along the Gulf Coast before heading toward the Ohio Valley. Pretty typical track this time of the year for tropical systems, and you might be thinking Harvey, you might be thinking Irma. Well, you can't necessarily compare this to those, at least at this point. Keep in mind, the Gulf is nice and calm. High pressure over Texas gives us a clockwise flow, dry air heading out into the Gulf. Over the Bahamas, there's still that wave of low pressure. Now, it's just a bunch of clouds, but there's also the bunch of clouds that is Tropical Depression number 16. Here's the way things are going to change in the next day or the next 2 days. That arrow shows the motion of the clouds over the Bahamas. Now, it's a very weak region of low pressure. It'll move westward across the Gulf of Mexico, not developing into anything. But once it gets into the western Gulf, that system we talked about, Tropical Depression number 16, will be moving into the southern Gulf. So they're not actually going to be at the same place during the same time, but either way it means we're going to have a moderate region of low pressure in the Gulf and a weak region of low pressure in the Gulf, and it's possible they could interact. In other words, one could sort of tug at the other. It's not likely they're going to combine, but they could kind of spin around each other, something called the Fujiwara effect. It's named after a researcher, but either way, that's going to control exactly where number 16 will be and what it will be. So as we look toward our weekend, lots of mystery still because it's many days out. What will the wind be at landfall? Unknown totally. Where will it make landfall is perhaps the biggest mystery, and between that and the size of the storm, that controls how much rain you get, where the threat of tornadoes might be. Of course, it also controls the possibility of surge, storm surge, and then flooding rain. So all of these right now still mysteries because we are days away, but as we move closer toward the weekend on the Gulf Coast, the picture will become a little more focused. Here's what we do know. Tonight, tomorrow, it likely becomes Tropical Storm Nate. All it has to do is increase winds by 5 miles an hour. So between tomorrow and then on Friday, the winds pick up, going to maybe 70 miles an hour on Friday. Now keep in mind, this is the forecast cone for the center of the storm. In a perfect forecast, right down the middle. But our forecasts are never perfect. They're usually good, which means it could be anywhere within the cone, could be approaching the Yucatan. And on Friday, even though it won't be in the Gulf, that's the point where the north central Gulf of Mexico will start to see watches issued either for hurricane or for tropical storm. And that's because on Saturday, it's very likely going to become a Category 1 hurricane, winds of about 85 miles an hour. So Saturday, hurricane likely, Hurricane Nate in the Gulf of Mexico. Sunday, landfall likely. And look at that huge area of possibility. Anywhere from New Orleans all the way east past Tallahassee. So all of these communities have to watch for the possibility of a landfall anytime between early Sunday and late on Sunday of a hurricane. Now, the forecast track is even though it's not perfect, it's usually better than the wind. So when you look at the winds, you have to also keep in mind it could be a little stronger or it could be a little bit weaker. So all the variables I just talked about, you have to keep in mind. A hurricane or tropical storm, typically the strongest wind is right around the eye in what we call the eye wall, but it also has bands of rain feeding into it we call feeder bands, and within those feeder bands you get the big downpours, you get the gustiest wind, and sometimes you can get some isolated tornadoes. And those feeder bands, they can actually rotate with the storm as the storm approaches. So by the time we hit Sunday, the question mark will be where will the center of that storm be and how wide the storm will be. If it's a very small storm like Hurricane Dennis, the hurricane force winds, the radius, only went out a couple dozen miles versus a storm like Katrina where the hurricane force winds went out 80, 100, 110 miles. So that's what we're going to find out this weekend. But notice, as they get closer to land, On the west side, at least for the north central Gulf Coast, the west side has the drier air heading out into the Gulf of Mexico. The east side will have the more moist air and the higher threat of tornadoes and the higher risk of storm surge. But again, we don't know how large this system is going to be or how strong the winds will be. So we'll keep you updated. Make sure you have at least half a plan right now for the weekend. It is going to rain Saturday and Sunday. How much? Unknown at this point. But again, landfall likely Sunday along the north central Gulf Coast. I'm Chief Meteorologist Alan Seals.